Morning, folks, and thank you to Ulster Wildlife for the invite. To introduce myself, I spent 35 years in the Department of Agriculture Science Service, and then which became the Agri-Food and Biosciences Institute. As a fisheries scientist, the last 30 of those years were in freshwater. And when I retired a year and a half ago, I retired as leader of the freshwater fish section in AFBI. Our job was to look at freshwater, all things freshwater fish in Northern Ireland, with a very strong government advisory role. And Lough Neagh, obviously, was a key part of that picture. I'm going to start this talk a long time ago. And if you look at Ireland at the last glacial maximum, you see that there was no fresh water. Ice melted. Ireland was surrounded by salt water, which is very, very different from the rest of Northwest Europe and the UK. So we got a different mix of species. Next slide, please, Chris. And the fish that we got have to have recolonized by migrating from the sea. So you can imagine around the coast, as the climate was warming and the sea was, and the temperatures were rising as they are now, but rather differently, fish were spreading, and these fish were in rivers to the south and working their way into new rivers. And so the salmon can swim upstream, the eels can climb, they have to get in somehow. Next slide, please, Chris. And the earliest archaeological records we have are from Mount Sandal dig on the River Bann, done dug about maybe 50 years ago, and they found human settlers harvesting fish from the Bann, and they were eating salmon, trout, and eel, identifiable from bones in the archaeology. Next slide, please, Chris. And then going to a list then of what would have been about and what can survive salt water as well as fresh water, gives us our list of fish we can be confident are true post-glacial natives. And the list is in yellow for the ones in Lough Neagh. There are two additional ones. There's the shad in Killarney and Arctic char, which we don't have in Lough Neagh at the present day. So they're basically lampreys, trout and salmon family, and sticklebacks. And I put flounder on there because they can penetrate quite a long way into fresh water, and have been found, for instance, in the lower reaches of the Armagh Blackwater. So they're in Lough Neagh in small numbers. Next slide, please, Chris. And then there's another list, which we have based on the fish we have today, which are really probable introductions. There is no real logical explanation how these things got to Ireland other than with human hand. And again, the ones on that lit group that we have in Lough Neagh are in yellow block on the left. And there are no real surprises there, but these fish do not tolerate any quantity of salt water year round, and basically have to have been brought by people at some point in history. Next slide, please, Chris. So I'm going to take you through the ones we have and give a quick sort of fish as wildlife, if you like, view of them, looking at their biology, and then try and the next step will be then to put that together to the Lough Neagh fish population. Slide, please, Chris. The first group are the lampreys. And in the Lough Neagh Bann system, there are three species. There's the brook lamprey, the river lamprey, and the sea lamprey. The sea lamprey currently does not penetrate upstream above Carnroe Weir on the lower Bann, where it spawns downstream of the weir. It's a large lamprey, parasitic on marine fish, but all these lampreys have their larval stage in freshwater, in muddy bits of rivers. Next slide, please, Chris. And the most important one is the river lamprey. Lough Neagh has a unique population of this. There's another similar one in Loch Lomond in Scotland. And it's a landlocked form of the river lamprey. In other words, it no longer returns from the sea to spawn. The lamprey is resident in Lough Neagh, and it's a medium-sized lamprey, up to 25 centimeters. The larvae live in mud, and the adults spawn on gravel, on harder grounds in summer. And this is very much parasitic on fish. So in the adult phase, the larvae eat very small things in the mud, and the adults eat fish. Next slide, please, Chris. And you can see here a salmon smolt heading down the ban with a significant sea lamprey, a river lamprey bite in it. These seem to have become maybe more of an issue in recent years, and in one of the latter publications I was involved with at work was to be a co-author on a paper on looking at these lampreys as they fed on the salmon smolts and what impact they might have. Next slide, please, Chris. We're all familiar with the eel, and it's larval, and it's arriving from the sea as a glass eel, transparent, turning black, brown, becoming a brown eel, spending anything up to 10 to 25 years, depending on location and its gender, in fresh water, and then turning around and heading back to Sargasso to sea. It's a very, very adaptable species. It can tolerate a huge range of conditions and adjust its growth rate to suit. It occurs from Morocco to Norway in fresh water, and it has a number of habitats that are critical to it. It needs the ocean for its migrations and spawning. It needs the right conditions, inshore and estuaries, to come into. It needs the right kind of places in lakes. It likes soft ground and structure and places to hide, and is strongly nocturnal. And next slide, please, Chris. Another fish which is unique to Lough Neagh, there are other trouts in other places. This is a trout subspecies, or group of subspecies they call the dollaghan. It lives in Lough Neagh, but it spawns in the feeder streams. Most of the large feeder streams have at least some dollaghan stock. The key spawning areas from recent studies have been the Kelswater, a tributary of the Main, and the 6 Mile, which comes in at Antrim. And a recent Queen's study came up with the view that of the fish in the lake, perhaps 60+% were actually spawning in those two rivers, with smaller numbers coming from rivers like the Upper Bann, the Blackwater, the Moyola, the Ballinderry, and some in the Crumlin, maybe Glenavy system. So an amazing fish, and highly sought after by anglers in its freshwater phase, in its river phase, and a commercial species in the lake itself. Again, trout will eat anything that moves, from small to big, very adaptable, which is part of its strength. But it does have to have good, clean, gravelly rivers for spawning, and the right stony, fast-flowing habitats for juveniles to grow and survive before they migrate downstream. Next slide, please, Chris. And then on to the pollan. It's a landlocked form of a group of fishes called the whitefish. They're related to salmon and trout. Some people call it a freshwater herring. It is not related to herrings. It has the adipose fin, which is the small fin between the back fin and the tail fin, which is characteristic of salmonids. It has a very short lifespan, 3 to 4 years, 3 to 4 generations, exceptionally 6. And I have once aged one at 7 from Lower Lough Neagh, but that lifespan may crop up later in the talk as a disadvantage to it. It needs zooplankton when it's young and in the fry stage, quite a critical phase. But when it gets bigger, it will eat insects and invertebrates. And it spawns on hard grounds in Lough Neagh, mainly inshore areas. Nobody's quite sure exactly where all the spawning grounds are, but that seems to be its habitat. It scatters its eggs, which drop in among stones. And the rest of the time of the year, it's pelagic, i.e. it lives in mid-water, and it can be found almost anywhere in the loch. If it's given a chance, as it does in the Shannon and lakes and the Erne system, where it also occurs, it will seek out deep, cold water in summer. It's on its upper edge of its temperature tolerances in Lough Neagh. Next slide, please, Chris. The critical biological description of the pollen, and which gives it an identity, is that it diverged from the Arctic cisco, which is a similar marine fish species which lives in the sea but runs into fresh water to spawn on the edge of the ice. And it currently occurs, it's gone way north, it currently occurs in Arctic Canada, Alaska, Siberia, and runs into rivers on ice melt, in and out and short runs. It's but that 160,000 years means that it had already diverged at the last glaciation, and the fish that colonized Ireland had split from the Arctic cisco in the interglacial. So it's Ireland's currently only true endemic, true vertebrate species. Now, that's not going to annoy some Ulster Wildlife members who like the Irish hare, but the Irish hare is a race of the mountain hare, which is post-glacially separated. You're talking about 10, 15,000 years, not 160,000. So this could be Ireland's most important native vertebrate. So I'm just giving a word for the fish. Next slide, please, Chris. The pike. You either love them or hate them. They're a fascinating fish. They're an apex predator. They're the nearest thing we have to a river monster. They can live maybe 10, 12 years and get to top end 40 pounds in weight, and over 4.5 feet long. Their food in the adult phase is largely fish, but they will also take waterfowl, and that's not hearsay. Many people have seen them, and I have seen them taking ducklings, and they'll eat frogs and amphibians. It likes particular habitats. It likes structure, so it plants and cover. And so for a long time in Lough Neagh, for about 40 years until very recently, it was not doing well. It was almost absent from Lough Neagh. There were no shallow, flooded margin plant spawning areas on the shores. The Lough Neagh is a pretty exposed, rough place with hard shores, and the wind can blow from any direction. And there wasn't much spawning habitat for pike. It has recently had a resurgence post-zebra mussel, post-clear water, with emergence of water plants. It's a politically charged species because it has traditionally been controlled in targeted trout fisheries. And it's an ecosystem engineer. It does affect all the other species, and it will, in some cases, reduce trout stocks and reduce salmonid stocks. So the pike anglers perhaps don't like that. The trout anglers sometimes do. And most recent science on it suggested that it may be older than the Norman introduction. There may actually have been an introduction in Celtic times. So it may have been for a bit longer. But it's a fish which raises emotions. But when you see a big one, there's a spectacular animal. Next slide, please, Chris. The salmon. The salmon uses Lough Neagh as a resting place on its upstream migration. It comes up the Bann, and then, like the trout, they spawn in the feeder streams. So it needs the lake to be clean enough, clear enough, and a happy place to be. It is really in transit, but there can be significant numbers, hundreds of thousands of smolts going down through Lough Neagh every year to sea, and tens of thousands of adults coming back up. But it's using the lake as a transit stop. Next slide, please, Chris. And the perch, arguably perhaps the prettiest of all the species. Um, it's a lovely looking little fish, all red and green and black and stripy. It's a very adaptable species. It's widespread North Temperate Europe, and lives potentially up to 12 years. Interestingly, in Lough Neagh, it's hard to find one over about 4 years. It is commercially fished, and its food is plankton when it's young, invertebrates, insects, and the larger invertebrates, once they get to over 8 or 9 inches, they'll eat a lot of fish fry. And it likes open water, but its preference is for clear water, not murky water, and it likes waterweed beds to hide in. Next slide, please, Chris. And then the roach, which is the most recent addition. I recall the first roach arriving in the ban system when I lived in Coleraine as a teenager. So you're talking about 1970s. Its introduction to Ireland was in the late 1800s with an accident with a bait box in the Blackwater, in the Republic of Ireland, Blackwater. It's an interesting species in that it probably has a slightly more southerly European distribution than the perch. It's highly dependent on zooplankton for its first 2 to 3 years. That's critical to what's something that will come later in the talk. It's one of the few species that can eat some algae and plant material. Whether it derives much nutrient from it is another matter. It's an open water species, but it thrives in murky water and is pollution tolerant. So it has done extremely well, and it rapidly became the most abundant fish in Lough Neagh after its colonization, certainly by the 1980s. And it then has knock-on impacts on other species, providing fodder for predatory fish. And it has been tagged with the or blamed, tagged or blamed, however you see it, depending on whether you like birds or you don't like birds, for the rise in cormorant populations. So providing them with a winter food for what was prior to our roach, a marine coastal bird. And it enabled the colonization of Lough Neagh by cormorants. Next slide, please. Then we have the bream, a probable medieval introduction. One of the things monastic peoples, the monks would have liked in their ponds. It survives in still waters. A very long-lived species, 15 to 20 plus years. Like the roach, the fry need zooplankton to eat, and the older fish then move on to invertebrates. I've seen some lovely ultrasound pictures of lakes in the Norfolk Broads with pockmarked with what look like golfers' iron shots digging up a fairway, and it's actually the bream making holes in the mud to feed. And they'll stand on their heads and shove themselves down to eat midge larvae and other things that are in the mud. And it likes open areas with a soft bottom, and it's an early summer breeder. Next slide, please, Chris. Then you have a group of fish which are some of them not quite so important yet. The carp and the tench on the left do occur in Lough Neagh, not in large numbers. They're again probable medieval introductions to Ireland. Gudgeon is common middle bottom, but is probably largely unstudied. It's not a commercial importance, but it is abundant, and it probably has a more significant role in the ecology than we think. The three-spine stickleback can be very, very abundant and is probably highly significant in the ecology, but it probably needs a little bit more science to study it. And then you have rudd, which are present largely only in small feeder lakes and occasionally turn up in Lough Neagh. It is a medieval introduction which populations collapsed of when the roach arrived. The roach outcompeted and seemed to push it out really rapidly. And the minnow is present in some of the feeder streams. Not really a lake stock, but it will turn up in the lake from time to time. Next slide, please, Chris. So then you put all these fish into Lough Neagh, and what determines, the question for scientists is what determines how the resultant population turns out. And it's not a simple question. It depends on a whole range of things. The fish need, each individual fish has particular requirements for habitat, for its spawning, food, where its young fish are going to grow, how it competes with others, and temperature tolerance, and trophic status. Next slide, please, Chris. And the standard international classifications, a boring table for trophic status. The words are probably becoming quite familiar given the recent issues in Lough Neagh, from nearly ultra oligotrophic, which is very, very low nutrients, like a high mountain lake with no nitrogen, no phosphorus, up to hypertrophic, which is over 100 milligrams per meter or micrograms per liter, same unit of phosphorus, with lots of chlorophyll, lots of green algae, and really murky water. Lough Neagh is firmly and squarely in the hypertrophic zone and above. You know, we're looking at 100. Next slide, please, Chris. And then, so this is a sort of schematic of the tolerance of North Temperate European fish to trophic status. At the low end, the sliding scale, oligotrophic, at the top, you see 4 milligrams per phosphorus, you get Arctic char. They disappear very, very rapidly as the nutrient levels rise. And they were gone from Lough Neagh probably sometime in the 1800s. They're so long ago, it's hard to find any good records, but they were there once. Then you have the trout. And as the lake gets richer and becomes into the hyper-eutrophic state where Lough Neagh is in now, on a European scale, we would expect to be having carp, bream, roach, eel. That's it. We should have lost, Lough Neagh should, on this theory, should have lost everything else by now, and it hasn't, which is down to some very peculiar and interesting features of Lough Neagh itself. Next slide, please, Chris. And in this mix, prizes to anybody who guesses that this is an antique minnow trap. Anyway, I needed something to illustrate a bottleneck. Next slide, please, Chris. A bottleneck occurs in the life stage of fish. Now, this is a composite slide of different species, but all fish have adults, eggs, larvae, fry, growing stages, and back to adults. And at each stage, there's a particular set of conditions. They need particular things, particular temperatures. And if it doesn't happen for them at any one point, you get a bottleneck in the population, which means that the numbers coming out the end are much smaller than the number going into that phase. And that can drive the stock of a whole species. So, and everyone has a different set of requirements and conditions. And that feeds into the ecology of how a fish finds its place in the mix of species that's there. Next slide, please, Chris. One strong characteristic for Lough Neagh is almost all the species that are there eat zooplankton at some point in their lives, very often in the stage between larva and fry in their first year. Roach, they need it for up to the first 2 or even maybe 3 years, depending on how big they are. But this is one commonality between most of the species, except the trout, where the larvae, the juvenile stages are not in the lake, they're up in the feeder streams. Next slide, please, Chris. And then the migratory species may not just have bottlenecks in freshwater, they have bottlenecks at sea. These two graphs, the left-hand one is of salmon sea survival from the river Bush, which would also apply to the river Bann. And you can see that from the 1980s to present, both the salmon on the left and the numbers of glass eel coming into European shores have declined markedly, down to perhaps 10% of where they were 30 years ago. And this creates a marine bottleneck for the migratory species, which is actually outside the lake and very, very difficult to control or even manage, even if you have we don't have the tools to control the ocean. Next slide, please. And then again, the migratory species have man-made problems. This is the lower Bann. The left-hand side, you've got the fish pass at Kilrea, you've got Migratory Weir in the middle, and Carnroe Weir. Conroe is actually going through a major renovation with a brand new whiz-bang latest generation fish pass. At the minute, it's causing some issues construction-wise and for the fishing in the river. But it may be that after that's done, things like the sea lamprey will make it up to the next weir at Mavanacher. And the eel and salmon can get through these. Eels can climb, salmon can jump. But these are actually quite effective barriers to other species which don't. And you tend to get where the lower ban is populated by fish from Lough Neagh, but they don't go back up again. So there's a drip feed of fry of all species, and the lower ban and Lough Beg to a certain extent are probably dependent on downdrift from Lough Neagh for a lot of its resident fish stocks, because they go down over these weirs, they don't come back up of them. Next slide, please. And then, not to forget, the feeder streams of Lough Neagh also have mill weirs and fish passes in some places. This is the Crumlin Falls. And these have to be working for the continuity of all the fish and habitat, for the trout to reach their full potential and the salmon to reach their full potential upstream of Lough Neagh. Next slide, please, Chris. All this put together creates variation, and you can get, for any fish species, a golden generation where everything goes for them. The spawning temperature is right, the weather is right, the habitat's not flooded at the wrong time. And you can see that on this slide, what you see is left to right is each bar, horizontal bar, is a snapshot of the fish population. And the yellow bars are the abundance. So you see, as in 1991, this is Lough Erne data, but the same thing happens in Lough Neagh. You see, at any one point in time, you'll see that particularly in a roach stock, the population can be dominated by one or two year classes. At the base of this slide, I have superimposed the nominal ages at the various lengths. So these are from 5 to 30 centimeters and 0 to 13 years in the case of roach. This same process happens in all the fish species. So at any one point in time, some will be strong, some will be weak. And when you're talking about fisheries management for angling or exploitation fisheries, you need to know what's going on so that you can manage within the capacity of what you have, which might be very different from what you had 5 years ago, and it might be very different from what you have in 5 years' time. And the shorter, I talked about pollen and lifespan, the shorter the lifespan of your fish, the higher the risk. A roach can survive 4 years without recruitment quite fine because they'll live to 13 years. A pollen, if it gets 4 years without recruitment and everything goes wrong for them, is gone. That's the kind of sort of one of the key issues about fisheries management is knowing your individual species and their variations. Next slide, please, Chris. But then putting all this together and giving you some kind of a flavor of what's in Lough Neagh in current conditions. And I'm talking about 5 years ago now. So I'm really, my baseline for this, I've thrown the eel in there. It's very difficult to put the eel on the relative abundance. This is basically, for every trout, you have 100 roach or 100 perch, slightly fewer pollen. Difficult to put the eel in there because the eel is not surveyed with the same techniques in the same place, and you have to do a composite. I've thrown the eel figure here based on a sort of calculation based on the number of eel caught and the proportion that might be of what's left. So it gives you that kind of number. But you get this kind of, and this would have been a relatively stable from the 1990s through to perhaps 2015, 2020. And we kind of had, and when I was, and my colleagues were starting to build a management framework, we kind of knew what we were dealing with, and you were getting somewhere where you could make sensible recommendations on how to look after the place. Next slide, please, Chris. But then you've got the flyers, and then there's always something that can go wrong. So the short section here on what's out there, the non-natives that we have to look out for. Next slide, please, Chris. There are two species in Ireland, the chub and the dace. The dace actually were introduced to the Cork Blackwater simultaneously with the same accident that brought the roach to Ireland, but they have not spread anything like as rapidly northwards. but they are slowly spreading up through the Shannon system. And it's probably on a decadal scale only a matter of time. The chub is present in the River Inny, which is a tributary of the Shannon, and it was introduced probably deliberately by some misguided person who liked to fish for them from England in perhaps 15 years ago. Inland Fisheries Ireland had a real good go at eliminating it from the Inny and were almost successful, but the recent reports are that it has reappeared. So maybe somebody's brought some more, somebody's insistent they want to have chub, or maybe it just didn't get eradicated. But that chub are quite a large, powerful cyprinid carp family type fish, quite happy in lakes. Sooner or later, we will get chub in Lough Neagh. It's almost inevitable. Once a fish is in, the boundaries of river catchments only last a certain length of time. It seems to be history and the way history works and the way people work. Next slide, please, Chris. And then you have the group of fish which got there. Remember the slide at the beginning and the connectiveness of freshwaters in England to European freshwaters after the Ice Age. A whole pile of species which would do quite well here if they got here. And any one of them could colonize and skew the balance, fill niches, change the populations, and you're starting again with your calculations on how to look after the place and what you need to do to them. And these are a watch list, and they're definitely out there. Next slide, please, Chris. And flyers, these two pictures were supplied to me they came from Lough Neagh fishermen. The sturgeon is a genuine sturgeon. Species-wise, I don't think I've seen the genetic analysis. It did go to Queen's. It was several years back, whether it was sorted out. It's probably a young, either Atlantic or European sturgeon. The most likelihood is that it came into to the aquarium trade, was in somebody's pond, got too big and was dumped. But in theory, they're migratory species. They may once have been in the ban. I'm not quite sure that the ban would have been the right kind of river, but the Foyle certainly in post-glacial times, and perhaps the Shannon would have been strong candidates for having sturgeon originally. They do not like weirs. They don't jump like salmon. And they like deep, fast-flowing bits with gravel beds at the tidal head to spawn, which we haven't got at the minute. The bottom one is an armored catfish, which is an Amazon basin species. And there's absolutely no doubt that this is somebody's pet that got too big. It probably wouldn't have survived the winter if it hadn't been caught by a Lough Neagh fisherman first. We tried to look after it in Athby for a while, but it died of cold. So sad end to somebody's pet fish. But these things turn up from time to time and will with aquarium activities going on. Next slide, please, Chris. And then you have the ones that people really love and anglers really love to fish. And people sometimes just don't get that Ireland doesn't have grayling and barbel. Nice fish in themselves, they like relatively clean rivers. The grayling provides trout fishermen with fly fishing through the winter when the trout season is closed in England. And the barbel is a very popular coarse fishing species, and particularly in middle southern England. But either one of them would take a whack out of a niche of something that we have already here and would confuse things. So I'm not advocating adding these things to Ireland. They'll just confuse things even more. Next slide, please, Chris. More likely immigrants are things that just slip in unnoticed or with a batch of other fish. This is a thing called a stone morocco or a topmouth gudgeon. It's a Caspian Sea basin species, and it has spread rapidly through Europe. It causes a right mess when it gets into a lake or a pond. The Environment Agency in England have It's the one species they will actually take out the pesticide poison for and wipe out everything in a small lake just to get rid of it. It colonizes very rapidly. It dominates the entire biomass and just gets in everybody's way. And it's present, being worked on in England, but in the northern or nearest places in northwestern Europe. And this photograph I took in Belgium, and the pond was absolutely rammed with the things, and there wasn't much else. So we don't particularly want this one either. So again, it's on the watch list. Next slide, please, Chris.
Robert, can we just go for another 5 minutes just to give enough time for questions, if that's okay?
Okay, do that. Yes.
Brilliant.
I'll keep flick. We'll go speed up. Lough Neagh is rising. Temperature is rising. 10 degrees over 15 years. 1 degree over the last 30 years, 1.5 degrees of 30 years. That makes a big difference to what lives here and what might come here. Next slide, please, Chris. And the one feature of Lough Neagh which keeps it alive is the wind. And another slide, please. Lough Neagh doesn't look like this very often. A former professor of lakes at Ulster University, Brian Wood, used to say that the one thing that stands between Lough Neagh and complete meltdown is 8 weeks of flat, calm summer weather. And given its richness, its trophic status, its algal crop, if we get this for 8 weeks, we start to get the temperature rising at the surface, the lake warms, the oxygen levels at the bed start to decline, and the fish are squeezed in a sandwich between a surface, particularly the pollen, that's too hot for them, and a bed layer which doesn't have enough air in it. And that is, but it never happens, because after about 6 weeks, the wind blows again. But if it did happen, we would have a severe problem. And it's not just that these are also the conditions for blue-green algae. They're not good for anything. Next slide, please, Chris. Commercial fishing, sustainability, mixed stocks, you can see there, up to 300 tons of pollen in a good year, but very variable. Next slide, please, Chris. And eel fishing peaked at 1,000 tons, down perhaps to 200, 300 tons a year. Next slide, please, Chris. And the eel has produced a unique heritage with local methods, really interesting social value, local techniques, and unique to Lough Neagh, with from long lines to the silver eel catching systems. Next slide, please, Chris. To particular netting methods which are unique, and gill netting specific to specific species with the right meshes for the right species. They used to be linen. One of the issues now is that they're not linen, and they're much thinner meshes, and they are thinner twines, stronger, and they're man-made. So you can fish more of them, and you don't have to hang them out to dry all the time. So again, increasing effort by changing materials. Next slide, please, Chris. And enriched lakes are very, very productive. And enriched temperate lakes, give or take, one would expect Lough Neagh to have a standing stock of fish of at least 4,000 tons, of which we're currently harvesting annually 600, 800 tons, thereabouts. And given the fact that some commercial marine fisheries, which are well managed with good science, would take at least half the spawning stock biomass annually, it ought to be sustainable with the right methods and the right restrictions applied to the right species at the right time. That kind of level shouldn't be frightening. It looks terrifying to anglers who just don't deal in that kind of number of fish. But in the commercial terms, it's well on the scale of what should be manageable. Next slide, please, Chris. And the angling, also important. The 6 Mile Water, internationally known for its dollaghan fishing. People travel and will pay good money to come and catch one of these 6 to 10 pound or even more lovely brown trout, and they'll put it back. Next slide, please. And even in Lough Neagh, if you're prepared to try, you can catch fish on rod and line, even though very few people do. This is a photograph sent to me by a friend who went out to see could he catch pollan on a fly rod, and lo and behold, he could under the right conditions and with a little bit of trying. Next slide, please. And then came the zebra mussel. Everybody knows about the zebra mussel. It sat from Lough Neagh for a long time before its population exploded in sometime 2019. Next slide. And what they do, it's well rehearsed ground. They clear the water, they eat the benign green algae. They cause light to go deeper into the water. They are very probably the trigger for the recent blue-green algal blooms. They knock out the zooplankton and chironomid minges. Remember the key food for fish bit earlier? Everything needs those at some point. By filtering out the algae, those things have nothing to eat. So basically they're ripping out the base of the food chain before it gets going, and leaving the levels of nutrients, the nitrogen and phosphorus, still there for anything that's adaptable enough to use it. And that includes the cyanobacteria. Next slide, please. And these are the sort of stuff that, you know, we've all seen this, the news stories. It's horrifying. But it was, to a certain extent, predictable. And it was always one of those risks that was on the card from 2005 that we flagged up. There is a risk of a cyanobacterial bloom. Nobody really listened until it happened. Next slide, please. So what prospects for the fish under the new Lough Neagh? Zooplankton dependent species, reduced fry survival, so smaller numbers at the base of the chain of fish. The one adaptable feeder likely to gain advantage are the perch and the trout, who can switch to invertebrates. We're going to get water plants, which can see the light from 2.5 meters down, where they couldn't see the light from 0.5 meter down before. But the nutrients are still there, temperature rising, and we still have the potential risks in summer for oxygen deficiency. Next slide, please. And the calm summer periods will remain a significant risk. Next slide, please. The perch are the winners. Very quickly through these slides. Next one. In Lough Erne, the perch roach ratio before Lough Erne was 1 perch to 3 roach, and then it reversed to 3 perch to 1 roach. It's on its way to happening potentially in Lough Neagh. Next slide. This is the food chain nutrients, surface water green dominated, so nutrients basically resulting in roach. Next slide. But when you add the zebra mussel, the filtering puts all the algal and carbon material straight down to the bottom before it can proliferate, leaves organic matter on the lake bed, which feeds invertebrates, and that's the sort of thing that perch and trout can adapt to, but not the roach as quickly. And if the roach don't have zooplankton for the first 3 years and the pollen, their recruitment will collapse, and it looks like that might be happening. Next slide, please. There are some surprises. People have been reporting ephemera danica, mayfly, coming off Lough Neagh in the lower Bann, where it has not been for years. They actually like living in and around the pseudofecal sludge around zebra mussel colonies. Hardly surprising, perhaps, but interesting in the same. So there are some new species which will benefit. Next slide. And the pike has suddenly started to recruit, sometimes heavily in some years in Lough Neagh. The only possible reason for that is that we're now seeing beds of Elodea, Canadian and Nuttall's pondweeds, which are providing it with a spawning habitat which hasn't had for 40 years. And that weed has grown as a result of the new light climate and the nutrients left after the zebra mussel invasion. So again, an ecosystem changing apex predator with the capacity to impact and everything else. Nice to have in some places. We don't quite know. And there's a new study. My former colleagues are working hard to follow the rise of pike and see where it's going to go. So perhaps more for the future there. Next slide, please. And finally, conclusions, and following slide, please. And thanks to Ulster Wildlife for providing me to do this. again, to reiterate, it will remain hypertrophic. Green algae will remain moderated by zebra mussel. We are going to get cyanobacterial blooms in good weather in summer. The carbon to the lake bed, the stripping, the change in the food chain, the change in where the energy is in the system, the risk of summer calm, and water plants. They're more or less a given where we are now on the zebra mussel. And finally, please, the pollen. It's a true endemic. It's something we in Ireland are responsible for. If it disappears from Ireland, it disappears from the world. It's a glacial relic. It's an economic resource. It has huge cultural significance, and it's a sentinel of what makes Lough Neagh. It's the one species that spans a wide range of trophic status, and providing the wind blows and it stays clean, and we have cold enough winters, it will survive. If we don't look after Lough Neagh and start doing it quickly, it will not survive. We'll lose it. That's the bottom line, and it's worth fighting for. So thanks to Ulster Wildlife for the opportunity to talk. Apologies for the slideshow issues. I hope you get the flavour of what's there, and we can now move on to some questions.
Thank you so much, Robert. Yes, and just to reiterate those apologies, slow start, but I think Robert more than made up for it. So thank you very much, Robert. It was fascinating to get that overview of all the fish that we get at Lough Neagh, and also insights into some of the broader issues that they're facing beyond blue-green algae, and then also just some of your sort of expert forecasts as to what may play out in the years ahead. So we've got a few questions here. Let's just go from the top. So Alistair sent through the first question, and he would like to know, why do European male eels mature quicker than females?
That's a fascinating question. They mature at circa 10 years, 12 years, whereas the females don't turn around and go back to sea until they're 16, 17. Fisheries theory is that eel is adapted to kick the males out early when there is plenty of habitat. And when there is a surplus, when there's a surplus of glass eels, if you restrict the supply of glass eels, as is currently happening, the proportion of males actually decreases. They have what the density-dependent sex determination. So the thinner the population, the more females, which is an investment in long-term waiting for things to get better. And in places like northern Norway, you can have an old female eel 50 years running to sea after the problems which caused its recruitment to stop. And so this is the theory that as eels fill the habitat, if it gets too full, the males get kicked out early. It's a theory, but it is true of eels and all species of eel that the males mature earlier. They also have to leave earlier to get across the Atlantic to meet at the same time because they don't swim as fast. Well, that's one theory that's widely given as well.
Okay, and next question is from Dakota. So Dakota would like to know, if pollen are at the upper end of their temperature tolerance in Lough Neagh currently, what changes to their distribution are likely to see with the changing climate?
Yeah, unfortunately, the pollen is the next candidate for going the way of the Arctic char, with trophic status and with temperature rise. Summer temperatures if we got mixed water with water over 20, 21, 22, we're in severe trouble. If the winters stay as mild as they are and they stop going down below 5 or 6, these things are going to have trouble spawning because it's the cold weather in winter that triggers their spawning. So but they do persist in lakes or their analogues in continental lakes and other places, other species of whitefish in quite wide-ranging temperatures. So if we can get the nutrients down and the trophic status down, they have a much higher chance of surviving. That's the only thing we can do for them is to get the nutrients down.
Okay. Next question. Paul compliments you on a great talk. And this is an interesting one as well. I think he asks, Can anything eat or remove the zebras in enough numbers? Is there a fish species that can help?
Interesting, where the zebra mussels come from in the Caspian Sea basin and the Danube and lakes in that area. Some of the large cyprinid fish, the roach bream family, that have got pharyngeal teeth, so teeth built into the hardened teeth built into bony teeth into the sides of their gullets, can crush zebra mussel. The one fish we have here that can, you look at the food stock, summer contents and find a mush of zebra mussel, is actually the hybrid between the roach and the bream. Now, I haven't talked about this because it doesn't actually occur abundantly in Lough Neagh. It occurs enormously abundant in Lower Erne. And I think the reason for that must be that in the Erne system, they spawn at the same time in place, whereas Lough Neagh must give them some means of not spawning so you don't get the hybrids. And after that, the carps will eat them, will crush them, crush the shell. Bream are quite good at munching them. Again, good, strong pharyngeal teeth. But the rate of spread and the populations that develop will probably outstrip the feeding potential of any species that we have.
Okay, and next question is from Peter Archdale. So, if a magic wand was waved and all N and P, which I'm assuming stands for nitrates and phosphates, stopped entering Lough Neagh, how long would existing reservoir of nutrients remain, do you think?
I have to defer to experts on this one, but my former colleagues, and going back to the likes of Roger Smith, who used to work, and then right down to the current crop of limnologists, stroke soil scientists, they're talking 30 to 40 years before the system clears. I personally hope it would happen a little bit quicker and that the processes might be faster with temperature rise and increased rainfall. But again, you're talking decades. And the point I make ad nauseum is that it's 40 years from when you start doing something. And that start has not yet happened. We've been talking about it for 2 years, but that start hasn't happened.
Okay, and we have another question about pollen, Robert, and it's from Rory, and he wants to know, is it time for pollen arc sites?
Shall I say again, time for pollen?
Arc sites?
We have thought about this before, and we looked very hard for. We developed. There was a member of staff on Dara who developed aquaculture techniques. We proved they could breed them and produce the fry, and there are aquaculture facilities which can produce whitefish fry in Eastern Europe, and they're farmed, so that can be done. But where to put them? You need a large, clean lake, preferably without roach, and in good condition. We have thought about this, and there aren't many options really of suitable places. It could be tried. You could maybe look at some upland reservoir or something like that, where you don't have too many fish, and where there is reasonable feed for them. But there are a big lake species, and you know, the Lough Neagh, Lower Lough Erne, and the Five Shannon Lakes are their refuge.
Okay,
and Lough Allen is probably the least known, most recently discovered. I and a group of other scientists discovered the pollen Lough Allen about 15 years ago, where we didn't know they were there. But that is probably the cleanest of the lakes in Ireland currently with pollen in.
Okay, this next question is probably a bit of a follow-on from that. It's from Rosemary Mulholland, who is our head of nature recovery at Ulster Wildlife. So Rosemary asks, how are pollen found in the other lakes where they are found?
In Lower Lough Erne, the one thing that keeps them going is the fact that Lough Erne stratifies in summer, leaving a deep, cold reservoir. Lough Erne is 60 meters deep in its middle, and there's a large basin which is more than 30 meters. Lough Neagh average is 10 meters with a few small pockets below, deeper than 10 or 15. So in the other lakes, in the Lough Erne, they seem to dive deep and go cold. They have a smaller population, but it seems to help them. In the Shannon Lakes, they decrease in abundance per unit area as you go from Lough Allen down through Lough Ree and down through, and then they're present in Lough Derg, but not doing as well in Lough Derg. So again, it's a case of enrichment, basically. As you go further down the system, it's becoming richer. And the Shannon Lakes, Ree and Derg, do have 30, 40 meter deep water and some colder summer refuges in some years for them. So they don't have to tolerate the heat. The Lough Neagh ones, they just, it's almost staggering that they're still there.
Okay. Next one, we're nearly at an end. So this one's from Ronan, and there's a few parts to this, I suppose. So the first part of the question that Ronan asks is, do you think there's much merit in engineering solutions to some of these problems? For example, would it be impractical to oxygenate the water artificially? And then he goes on to say that I think there's a few companies who are given funding to work on solutions to the cyanobacteria. Do you hold much hope for that?
That's a very, very loaded question in relation to initiatives that are being tried. Um, I don't personally think that there is any better solution than taking the environment back to something that's friendlier to them. Having said that, one has to applaud the initiative, at least think and try and outside the box. Is there something you can do about the algal blooms or that has not been tried before? But the global perspective, including the North American lakes, post zebra mussel and everywhere else zebra mussel exerts an influence, would not be particularly hopeful for an engineered solution. Let's say that. I'm not saying it's not possible. It hasn't been done anywhere else, and people
Okay.
have tried.
And then
Um,
just one, sorry,
Sorry,
sorry.
Chris, oxygenate, and the other part of the question, oxygen artificially aerating a body as big as Lough Neagh or oxygenating it is a mammoth task. Perhaps the biggest oxygenators that I can think of and during my career are the Thames Bubbler project and the Cardiff Bay Lagoon project. Both of those worked with with pure oxygen, not air. There's the Lough estuary has a bubbler which bubbles air. I'm not sure how effective it really is, but the scale, 400 square kilometers of water, the wind will do it for you in a day if it blows. So maybe we should turn the wind turbines on to consume power or something like that instead.
Okay. And final question then from Heather, who thanks you for a very informative talk. Heather wants to know, is there a way to see if the Lough Neagh fly?
The Lough Neagh fly is a chironomid. Its larvae feed on algae, and not the cyanobacteria, but the sort of small unicellular green algae we had before. The Lough Neagh fly probably peaked in its trophic status between, say, the 1970s and 2000. As the trophic status is artificially reduced at the minute, which has knocked it out, it's hard to know really whether it. And the other thing about chironomids is that they have a whole range of species which tolerate different sets of conditions. We might just get different ones, but the swarms of flies that cover your windscreen certainly don't seem to be there at the minute. And I don't know of a way to easily fix that other than, again, reduce the trophic status and bring everything back into something a bit more of an environmental balance, and it might work.
Okay, Robert. Well, thank you so much once again for your brilliant talk tonight, and thank you as well for answering all those questions. Certainly feel that they added a different dimension to the talk. I know I'm conscious that we have run over time, and that was obviously caused in part by some of the delays to begin with. Can I just check, in terms of the screen that's being shared at the moment, can everyone see upcoming winter talks? Is that what you're seeing on the screen at the moment? Okay, let me just stop sharing, and we're going to finish on this note. I just want to broadcast what's coming up next in terms of our talks. Okay, are we seeing that okay? Yep, super. Okay, so as I mentioned at the very start, we're about halfway through our online winter talks. So we've got another five for the next 5 weeks. So they're every Wednesday evening. The next one we have is high-tech nature conservation, which will be led by two members of our peatlands team. There are still tickets or spaces, I should say, at that. So if that's something you're interested in, please feel free to join. The event after that is unfortunately fully booked. It's the Magic of an Irish Rainforest. I think this one's been booked up for a few weeks now. It's very popular. There is a waiting list, so if it is something that you're interested in, join the waiting list. And if people aren't able to make it, then we'll let you know if there's a space to join that. After that, we have a talk exclusively about bats from Karen Healy from the NI Bat Group. And then our final two talks, which will be both delivered by Ulster Wildlife members of staff. So the first one there is all about helping hedgehogs, how to let nature in. That will be delivered by Maureen on Wednesday, the 12th of March. And then the final talk from Rosemary, who we had a question from earlier, is all about creating a butterfly-friendly garden. So if any of those topics appeal to you, there are, as I say, there are spaces remaining on all those other talks except the Irish Rainforest one. So do feel free to book onto those at ulsterwildlife.org events. You can see the link there at the bottom. And yeah, I think that's everything that we have time for, folks. So once again, just to apologize about the issues that we had earlier. Thank you very much for staying with us. Thank you once again for Robert delivering a brilliant talk. And thank you as well for your questions. We hope to see you again very soon. Thanks now.